Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third installment of our seminar series entitled The Difficult Heritages, Monuments, Memories, Conflicts, which I've had the pleasure to co-organize with my colleagues Francesco Cassata and Paola Valenti. Today, the speaker and our guest will be Professor James E. Young, and we are truly delighted to have him here with us on this occasion. Now, I'm confident that most, if not all of you, are familiar with Professor Young's work. Nonetheless, I will briefly present him to you. Professor Young is Distinguished Professor of English and Judaic Studies Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and founding director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at the same institution. He's a scholar of international renown, best known for his work at the intersection between memory, art, and architecture. He's author of several groundbreaking books, which have become veritable classics in the field, such as Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, The Texture of Memory, At Memory's Edge, After Images of the Holocaust in Contemporary Art and Architecture, and finally, The Stages of Memory, Reflections on Memorial Art, Loss, and the Spaces Between. He was also the guest curator of a very well-known exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York entitled The Art of Memory, Holocaust Memorials in History, and editor of its catalog. His expertise led him to be involved in the planning of fundamental memory markers of our time. In 1997, Professor Young was appointed by the Berlin Senate to the 5-member Findungskommission for Germany's National Memorial to Europe's Murdered Jews, which selected Peter Eismann's design, finished and dedicated in 2005. He has also consulted with Argentina's government on its memorial to the desaparecidos, and was appointed by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to the jury for the National 9/11 Memorial Design Competition, which was won by Michael Arad and Peter Walker in 2004 and inaugurated in 2011. At present, he is completing an insider story of the World Trade Center Memorial entitled Memory at Ground Zero, a juror's report on a World Trade Center site memorial and museum. Now, all these elements, I think, clearly illustrate why it was particularly important for us to have Professor Young as a speaker in our seminar series. Now I will finally give him the floor. Just a reminder, the title of his paper is National Memorials Against the Grain. And now, without further ado, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Guri, Paola, Francesco. Great to see everybody. I can actually see little slivers of you sometimes, which is nice. So I wanted to look at the ways that a kind of a new generation of artists is dealing with a question that ends up being more of a post-Holocaust question, post-Vietnam War question, and in this country, of course, a reckoning with America's history of racial terror against African Americans, dating back, to just after the Civil War. And the ways that nations struggle with how to internalize the memory of what end up being really national crimes, and sometimes even, I would say, crimes of origin. In the case of the United States in particular, the country really was built on the backs of enslaved Africans for some 250 years, and on the kind of the slow motion genocide of indigenous Native Americans as well. And of course, a nation's crimes traditionally never really become part of the memorial pantheon. Nations build their memorial culture, their memorial legacies on the history and memory of their great triumphs, sometimes their seemingly divine election, in their origins, often commemorating their victimization and their martyrdom, but never the crimes perpetrated in their name. But a generation of German artists in particular really did step up I would say in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and have answered that. And one of the strange results is that in some ways they have shown the world maybe how to address, how any nation can begin to address its national crimes and incorporate them into its national legacy. If anything, Americans have taken a lesson from this generation of young Germans and have now turned it, I would say, into America's greatest 21st century memorial, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, otherwise known as the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And that's where I'll kind of end this talk in a few minutes. But for us, it really kind of began with the, and for this generation of German artists, with Maya Lin and her design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1981. And here I'm going to open the slideshow.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. There we are. And Maya Lin's memorial, she once told me, actually began in its conception during her junior year abroad in Paris, where she spent time at the on the Ile de la Cité for the memorial to the deported Jews of Paris and France, designed by Henri Pangouchon. And what's interesting here is that, of course, this might be Europe's very first counter memorial to the Holocaust. It's not a memorial that ascends, but it's a flat, horizontal memorial at the top of it, into which one descends here. And as one descends down this very narrow staircase, the landscape is blocked out except for the very tip of the Notre Dame Cathedral, which you can see at the top there. And as Maya used to sit down in this space, kind of contemplating it, she came to understand it as a space that had been opened up in the landscape that might correspondingly open up a space within her or within us, the visitors, for memory. That this is a out, which would correspondingly carve out a space within us. And it's a triangular space. The only way out when you're kind of in it is this kind of grilled window, which looks across the Seine to the left bank. And if you're over on the other side of the river, what this appears to be is like a jutting, almost like the prow of a ship jutting into the river, like that. The boats are having to go around it on either side. And in the middle, of course, is this empty carved out space. What Maya did when she came back to Yale for her senior year was to take a monuments class from Vince Scully, kind of a renowned professor at Yale, who asked the whole class to enter the Vietnam Veterans Memorial competition. Now, remember, this is to commemorate the deaths of American soldiers, not the Vietnamese, not the war itself, but the soldiers. And it's called the Veterans Memorial. So really intended for the veterans to commemorate their own lost comrades, nearly 60,000 of them. But this was a war that America had come to hate. The veterans themselves were treated very badly on their return, despised by many as kind of warmongers, and they were sent to fight. They did their duty, but they were not received well when they came home. So the memory of this war, which was over just a few years before this competition, was very raw, and America's memory of it was very ambivalent as well. So Maya proposed carving out this space in the ground, a great counterpoint to all the great white monolithic neoclassic memorials in Washington, D.C. Hers would be instead a black wound in the earth. In effect, counterpointing maybe the very most aggressive form in architecture, which is the flying wedge. This flying wedge, this tip of the arrow, the tip of the spear, it's this aggressive thing here. But instead of creating this very aggressive point of the spear, she opened it up into the crook of an arm, inviting us to descend into that space. So from the very beginning, she counterpoints the military's most fearsome weapon, an architectural weapon, that flying wedge, and creates the space inside. She said it was as if she were going to take a knife and cut it into the earth, creating a wound that in fact would never really mend. It would be a space, she said, that people would come into and out of. And she compared it to, unlike a fixed monument, this would be a space that demanded movement into and out of it. It would be memory by means of perambulation. One axis points to the Washington Monument. One axis points to the Lincoln Memorial, thereby linking it to the two other great memorials on the National Mall, but counterpointing them at the same time. And she won this competition unanimously. It was a blind competition. It ended up being chaired, this competition, by Michael van Valkenburg, the chair of landscape design at Harvard University, and who was also on our jury in New York City, along with Maya Lin, for the 9/11 memorial, just so that you get a sense of the continuity here. So really, by counterpointing, all the rest of these great white neoclassic, monuments and memorials in Washington, D.C., she created America's first counter monument. Instead of gigantic figures on horses or gigantic, figurative soldiers, the only figures in this monument would be the figures, the reflections of those of us who are visiting. So these figures are now, by definition, humanly proportioned. They are us, reflecting back to us our own memorial preoccupations for coming here, not just a memorial telling us what to do or what to think or how to remember, but opening that space within us for memory. The names are arranged here, not alphabetically, but arranged in the order in which they fell in battle, so that these names would be re-embedded in their historical context. And this is also kind of a bit of a revolution, for other artists. You have to move in, you have to move out. People leave things here. There's a whole, there's going to be a whole museum just for the collected objects left here by everybody. People take rubbings. So it's very, very interactive. It's not a memorial. In fact, it invites complete decorum, but one that invites you to touch it and touch the engraved names and even to take the rubbing so that you can take the rubbing with you. Soldiers and vets I know who have visited have described the sensation of walking down this edge here, watching the grass grow up higher and higher and higher until it covers them over, feeling like they're walking into a grave to join their buddies, but then having the freedom and life that allows them to walk out of it and to reascend. But having been in this weird way, having joined them symbolically underground and now reascending, to rejoin life itself. So this memorial was dedicated in 1982, and this is right around the time that this generation of young German artists were also wrestling with how to remember something that they might rather forget, or in this case, how would a nation remember something that it might rather forget? How would a nation like Germany remember the memory of a national genocide perpetrated in the German name? against the Jews of Europe, and of course against other groups like Sinti and Roma, beginning with euthanasia programs, of course, very early on. So there was the first competition for a national memorial, a Denkmal, as it was going to be called, resulted in a terrible design being chosen. But one of the designs that was most interesting to me is this one by Horst Hoheisel, German artist from Kassel, who proposed taking the Brandenburger Tor and blowing it up, and then spreading the ground up remains of the Brandenburger Tor and covering them over with granite plates. How better to remember a destroyed people than by destroying your own national monument, in effect. He would now commemorate one void within the German nation with creating another void, creating a void, two voids in effect, which now become the memorial, which now has open space up in the landscape for people to come visit. And it's very clear that then the people themselves become the only vertical objects in this empty space. Hoheisel proposed this knowing it would probably never be accepted, but that was also part of his point. He wasn't sure that there should be a so-called final solution to Germany's national Holocaust memorial problem, and that maybe there should just be a kind of an ongoing continuation of competitions, and kind of an unresolved memory that would never actually be tied up in a nice, neat memorial at all. It was very clear that Horst had taken his cue in some ways from Maya Lin, as had Jochen Gertz and Esther Shalev Gertz, his wife, who early on, way before 1995, in 1986, just really 4 years after the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, won this competition for a memorial for peace and against violence in a generic Holocaust memorial in Hamburg. It was supposed to be sited near the Domtor in these gardens, but the artist insisted that it be moved out to an immigrant, kind of a Turkish immigrant neighborhood across the river in Harburg. And this is where, in fact, it was eventually installed. And as most of you know, this is a fairly familiar monument now to most Europeans, not because they actually saw it in person, but because they've heard this story about how this memorial challenged all the memorial conventions that came before it. In this case, they proposed this 12-meter tall lead-covered column that would, over time, as soon as 1.5 meter sections were covered with the names of people inscribing their own names into it, would be lowered into the ground. And one day, it will have disappeared completely, and the site of the Harburg Monument Against Fascism will be empty. In the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. And this, I think, is a revelatory insight. Jochen and Esther Gertz actually hate memorials and monuments. Jochen had designed several before this that would disappear and go away. So that the art, he said, must live within us. Once we've seen the art can go away and live only within us. And here, they both worried that creating memorials might become a substitute for actually doing anything against contemporary injustice and contemporary persecutions, contemporary genocides. In the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. Our memorials don't do this. We do it, inspired by our memorials. So they've created a space that, in effect, would return the burden of memory to those who come visit it. So at first, everybody added their names, just like this. And before long, it began to look like this, with occasional swastikas carved into it, magic marker, pen, and paint. It became kind of a mess. And the town actually wanted to get rid of it. And of course, the artist said, but you are getting rid of it. Is every 1.5 meter section you cover, we will lower it by that much. And so they did, little by little. And of course, the artist took great delight in this this picture of people, the Germans, getting rid of their Holocaust monument. How to remember something they'd rather forget? Get rid of it. And so it became kind of a performance. Jochen Gertz even described this once as a knife going into the back of Germany, this kind of memorial. Kind of a landscape harikari, he described it to me once as. He also described it as perhaps a barometer of contemporary anti-Semitism and xenophobia, suggesting that maybe it should go down as xenophobia goes down, but then with the rise of xenophobia, it could come back up also, like a barometer. But what this memorial ends up doing is challenging all those memorial conventions of permanence, of everlasting, this notion that the meanings are everlasting in these memorials, that they last forever. They don't, and in this case, of course, rather than inviting, it invites its own desecration, in effect. And in so doing, it removes itself altogether after about 12 sinkings in 1993. So between 1986 and 1993. Jochen Gertz was invited after this to the Institute of Fine Arts in Saarbrücken, where he conducted a class on memorial design, inviting his class to go out into the town and steal cobblestones and then come back at night and take up the cobblestones from the Saarbrücker Schloss here, the castle that had at one time been the Gestapo headquarters during the war. Take these cobblestones back up to the classroom, where the other part of the class was researching every last Jewish cemetery destroyed in Germany between 1933 and 1945. They carved the names of these cemeteries into the stones and then took them back down to the plaza and put them back in the ground without telling anybody. But of course, because this is Jochen Gertz's class, they've returned all the cobblestones inscribed side down. So there's no visible record of what they had just done. And then when the townspeople came down to see what they had done, this is now called, the invisible monument, 2,562 stones against racism. There's nothing to see. And the students just politely ask the visitors to look within themselves for the memory they hope to find here. So again, this idea of the vanishing monument, the invisible monument to remember a now vanished people in Germany. Going back to Horst Hoheisel, in the same year, 1986, that the Harburg Memorial was dedicated, Horst Hoheisel proposed this counter monument to recall the Aschrot-Brunnen, the Aschrot Fountain, which had been donated to the town of Kassel in 1911 by a Jewish philanthropist, and which was put in front of the town hall, a neo-Gothic fountain, a pyramid fountain that sprayed water up into the sky. But it was destroyed by the Nazis in 1938, called the Jews' Fountain, because it was a Jewish philanthropist who had donated it, and filled in with dirt and turned into a flower bed, which they called Aschrot's grave, or Grab. When the town wanted to rebuild it, Horst proposed taking the original design and building it into the ground. Again, once again, creating this negative form, creating something invisible from the top, so that when you come stand on it, you can actually see through the glass windows the form of the fountain itself. And the water now, instead of spritzing up, of course, just fills up in this little channel around and pours down into the monument, creating a rushing, gushing noise. And that ends up being the auditory experience. And the rest is just this interplay of light and reflection, in which the memorial remains kind of a phantom. And of course, in 1986, Horst didn't know anything about the Harburg Memorial competition. He and the Gertzes were doing this at the same time, without knowing anything about the other one. And he proposed that the memorial become a plinth or a pedestal on which the visitors stand, that the visitors themselves become the memorial. So here's this kind of this preoccupation again, once again, with the negative form, the invisible memorial, the people becoming the memorials for which they search, and causing them to look within themselves, for memory. So this theme gets picked up over and over again. In the competition for a memorial to the book burnings, won by Misha Ullman, an Israeli artist living part-time in Berlin, Misha proposed what he called bibliothek, which is a library. But instead of say, a sculptural figure of burning books or flames or anything like that, he took two steel tablets on either side, one where the two people are standing, and the other one in the near left corner, describing the book burnings of March 1933, and then on the other steel tablet, quoting Heinrich Heine, the great German Jewish poet, who once wrote that where books are burned, so too one day will people be burned as well. And then the middle space is actually a window that you come over and look into. So again, this preoccupation with the completely horizontal square, the only vertical figures being the people now doing the remembering, in this case looking down into a room full of empty bookshelves. The emptiness, the void left behind, will now be articulated by new emptiness, by new voids. The books cannot be restored. The authors cannot be restored. Loss is remembered with loss. And once again, this insight, this preoccupation amounts to what I ended up calling kind of a generation of anti-redemptory memorials. These aren't memorials meant to compensate or redeem terrible loss with new meaning or beauty, but are meant to articulate the loss and define the loss with further loss. To remember the destruction of a people with the further carving out of space, with further destruction. So during the time of the Denkmal process, while I was on that jury, I would leave my hotel every day and walk over this square, take a peek down into this room, and continue on to our meetings for the rest of the day. So it also had really an influence on me as well. In a similar vein, Rachel Whiteread, a great British artist, who won the Turner Prize in 1984 for filling a row house with concrete and then taking away all the scaffolding and all the boards and all the roof, leaving only the void articulated by concrete. For her, materiality was, as she said, an index for absence, and she wanted to articulate this absence. So she and her project Bibliothek, or library, also won the competition in Vienna on the Judenplatz for a national memorial to Austria's murdered Jews. Conceptually, it's meant to evoke the space between the leaves of books and the walls onto which the books are mounted or pushed. So it's meant to be, again, this articulation of empty space, a very small empty space between the leaves of books and the walls in a library, almost like the library is turned inside out. It was controversial at the time, not least because some local Austrians, Viennese, felt that there was already a memorial. This was being built on the Judenplatz, which was a place where in 1548 there had been a pogrom of a local Jewish community and an auto de fe, in which the Jews were forced into their synagogue and burned alive on the site. And it said, so we already remember this. But of course, Rachel Whiteread pointed out that it's true, you do remember it, but you remember it in a very particular way. And she took them into a nearby church where a tapestry told the story in Latin that on the site in 1548, the Hebrew dogs were punished for their crimes. So rather than letting that stand as the memorial, they went ahead. They created room in the excavation so that you could see the ruins of that synagogue, and you can also see this new memorial. But again, that articulation of empty space and given form, articulated this way, ends up returning over and over again, in this what I call this counter monument design. Shimon Atti, an American artist, went to Berlin in 1991, just about a year and a half after the wall fell, and was struck by what he didn't see there, which was any sign of Jewish life in the former this Schonenviertel, this quarter kind of in the middle of the city of Berlin, where stateless Jews had lived in the 20s and 30s, mostly from Poland. He found dozens and dozens of photographs, which he located by sight. He blew these into slide projections and then projected the slides of photographs onto the original sites where the photograph had been taken. This one, a doorway that had once been a Hebrew bookstore, another Hebrew bookstore, projecting onto these sites something that once seen, he hoped would now be stored in viewers' minds, so that when you turn the projection off, it would now be empty, but the image would now be locked in the minds of all who saw these things, these photographs. He did these without announcing where or when he was going to do it, so they became a little bit of a guerrilla action. But of course, the TV stations and photographers caught up, with these sites. There was some 35 in all. Jewish theater. But again, he would, the point being to reanimate these otherwise empty sites, empty and amnesiac, reanimate these sites with the memory of those who come to it. The responsibility for memory, lying with the visitors here. And then moving into the second memorial competition, after the first one was voided in 1995, the Germans spent really a couple of years in fierce debates with themselves as to how this could happen, how they could, completely bungle this national memorial competition for the murdered Jews of Europe. And they had invited me to give kind of a keynote talk at a series of symposia, the last one being in April 1997, in which I just simply compared the German memorial process to other nations and discussed the ways that Israel too had major problems in trying to come to terms with how to commemorate the Holocaust. America did, Poland did, that every nation had its own issues, and that Germany just happened to be the most difficult of all. This conundrum, how to reunite the two parts of Germany on the bedrock memory of a national crime. How to remember a people murdered in the national name, which is something that nobody had ever done before. And here I actually used the example of slavery in the Middle Passage. I said, where, for example, on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., is there even a single pebble to remember the slaves who had been auctioned on this very site, right in front of the White House, right in front of the Capitol building? Slave auctions were held on the mall, until the 1850s, and not even a stone, not even a pebble to remember them. That nations never build their memorial legacies, on the memory of national crimes perpetrated. That they remain inarticulated. It's this would be going in our term against the national grain. And yet here you were in Germany trying to make just this happen. And it kind of set everybody's minds at ease, and they decided to have a new competition. and asked me to join a jury, a Findungskommission of 5 members, which included, basically the head of the architectural reconstruction of Berlin, the head of the Deutsches Historisches Museum, the head of the Hamburg Art Museum, and the head of contemporary art in Bonn. And we were allowed to invite 25 artists, including the 10 finalists from the first competition, and received submissions from 19 of them, including what I would call the third finalist by Daniel Liebeskind, this kind of broken wall, which we liked for the ways that it allowed itself to overrun the site into the Tiergarten across the street, right to the Goethe bust on the left corner there. But we worried a little bit that, in 50 or 100 years, people might mistake this for the Berlin Wall, pieces being left behind. And Liebeskind described this basically as the voids that he had built into the Jewish Museum just a couple kilometers away would now be articulated in these sections. Our number 2 pick was proposed by Gesine Weinmiller, a young German architect whose work I loved, and actually who received 3 first-place votes in our first vote out of 5. And she proposed 18 segments of limestone block wall scattered randomly, seemingly, in this carved out section, 20,000 square meter site, inviting people to find their own way in and out. And then we discovered, walking along the parapet, that as we got to the right-hand corner, that these randomly arranged segments now congealed or composed themselves into a broken Star of David, and that as we continued walking around this parapet, they would decompose, back into kind of random segments. We thought it was a little gimmicky, but she didn't tell us. We found this out ourselves, and that once people knew about that they would spend all their time just doing this. But we did like the design, and you can see the clear debt even to the Maya Lin's design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's a space carved out. You descend into it. Everybody has to find their own way into and out of. It would also become memory by means of perambulation and not become a fixed object. And so very much, I think, in the mold, if you will, of some of these contemporary counter memorials, counter monuments. But the design that finally carried the day after several months of public debate, we ended up proposing Peter Eisenman and then with Richard Serra, who had proposed this field of stele, 4,200 stele, seemingly waving like a field of wheat. Ranging in height from ground level all the way up to almost 10 meters high, which would become very dangerous, we understood, as children would run out over the tops. Excuse me. And so we asked for them to pare it down a little bit. Here's the space where it was proposed. Many people have proposed as keeping the space open and allowing that to become the monument. This is what it looked like when the Berlin Wall went through it. So it was called kind of a no man's land with fences, guard towers, minefields. And at the very top of that East German flag there on the East German side was, of course, where Hitler's bunker was located. Excuse me for a moment. Peter Eisenman willingly modified his design down from 4,200 stele to 2,711. Richard Serra wanted no part of that. He said that the danger, the sense of danger, is part of my design's logic. That if you change that, it's no longer really my design. Eisenman agreed. Serra left the project, leaving only Eisenman as its sole author now. They're all scaled down. We thought that nothing would be higher than about 3 meters. I think they end up being a little bit more. And what we liked about it, obviously, was that everybody would have to find their own way in and out. It would be memory by means of perambulation once again. It would seem to be animated in this rolling topography. They would be blank-faced. There would be no inscriptions on them. We knew that they could be objects of graffiti, but we proposed building into them a solution that would make them very easy to wash, which we did. The chemical company Di Gusta came up with this idea. And so it remains wholly abstract. And about half the country, I think, has embraced it, and the other half of the country has not. But millions of tourists come every year to walk amid these stones. It's clearly a symbolic, graveyard on the one hand, but instead of a nice, precise military precision, we have waving tombstones, animated, different heights, different avenues of memory. You're alone and together at the same time. And the people do, of course, walk out on them, picnics on them. There are signs asking people to comport themselves, with decorum, but it's a public space. And short of putting up guard towers or barbed wire, you're going to have to let it be open and accessible from all sides. And people will really have to bring what they know of the mass murder of Jews by Germany in World War II. This memory will have to come with them. When we finally made the recommendation to the Bundestag, we proposed the memorial in 3 sections. First, do you want a central memorial to Europe's murdered Jews in Berlin? And if so, do you want the Peter Eisenman design, number 2 design, which we give you here? And if so, do you want a place of information to be built underneath? Since this would be a very abstract design, it could still be anchored in a hard historical narrative. The Parliament voted for all 3 of these. Not by the vote came just actually a few weeks after the end in 1999 of the NATO bombardment of Serbia, Belgrade, and in Kosovo, as the Serbs were pushing Kosovar Albanians into one corner of Kosovo in what looked like a certain genocide, and the Secretary of State, head of the Green Party, proposed that not just must we build a memorial, but if we do, we must also act upon it. That the memorial cannot be a substitute for action, and so ordered the German Air Force to join NATO in its bombardment, the first time since World War II that German planes had left German soil, now to prevent a genocide. So the place of information ends up being, I think, maybe Europe's greatest single small Holocaust museum. It's just 4 large rooms. And the designer, Dagmar von Wilken, has brilliantly created the impression that the stele sink into the museum space below, thereby creating kind of an interpenetration of the abstract design above with the information below, anchoring a very abstract design in very hard historical narrative. This was something we were aware of when we were trying to figure out the 9/11 memorial. That memorial is also built above a great museum. And they kind of interpenetrate this way so that we can anchor abstract memory in very concrete historical narrative, kind of the yin and yang of history and memory. And the kids do run out over the tops, as we were afraid they would. Stolpersteine, everybody's familiar with, I'm sure. In Hamburg, I mean, there are now some, I believe, nearly 30,000 Stolpersteine, these little brass cobblestones created by Guther Demnig, starting in 1997. Just telling the very brief story of Jews deported from the houses in which they lived, raised just slightly in order to stumble over them so that they become part of everyday life. Here lived Bernhard Bodenheimer, deported in 1942, murdered in Majdanek, June 20th, 1942, and his wife. Again, one of our great, one of the great European memorials, a great vernacular memorial. But again, remember, creating spaces in the landscape, not a vertical one, but one that really creates vertical human figures stopping to look down to see what they've stumbled upon. Another great design by Horst Hoheisel and Andreas Knitz, his artistic partner, to remember the Kristallnacht, the burning of this synagogue in the east, in which he has taken the foundation and used it as an outline for building this 3-meter tall wall around the edge of the foundation with no openings to recall the design of the synagogue that had been there. Knowing that Horst Hoheisel actually has a PhD in forestry, knowing that trees and brush and bushes would be planted, seeds of life would fall, from the birds, from the wind, and eventually life would take hold within these sealed off walls that we would see. This is the beginning, I think, of a generation of what we might end up calling green memorials, landscape memorials, and is fantastic by itself. And finally, we get to maybe America's second great counter memorial now, beginning with figurative design of enslaved Africans. But this is built as an extension of the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson's brainchild, which is to tell the unvarnished story of racial terror in America, starting from the beginning with slavery, but of course extending then for 250 years and then for another 150 years post-slavery. Brian Stevenson was fascinated by the Stele of the Berlin Denkmal. And so part of the design here are these really 2-meter tall, they're about 6 feet tall, about the size of a human being, each inscribed with a county's name where lynchings had taken place, and then the names of lynching victims also inscribed. As you enter the space, the ground begins to descend, and as it begins to descend, the stele begin to hang above you. Very much references to lynchings, very haunting, very powerful. Some about 804 of them. And that's 804 counties. The lynchings are multiplied by the number of names then on these stele. These are Corten steel, the same material that Richard Serra works with. And there are duplicates for each one of these hanging stele. Instead of being anchored in the ground as they are in Berlin, they are anchored in the heavens, in effect. And then the space below is carved out, and that ends up being our space. We end up being the only vertical things anchored in the ground. Each one of these has a duplicate. They are arranged in very neat stacks outside, inviting every single county named there to take theirs home and to install it in the site of the lynching in their county. So that when you visit this memorial and you see a county's Corten steel monument there with the county's name on it, you know that that county has not claimed its history yet, that it hasn't owned it yet, and is waiting to be owned and claimed by a contemporary generation. So this is also, again, a memorial by means of perambulation, negative forms, and really putting racial terror at the very heart of American history.